every day. And Dana, you're back in London after being in the south of France, and I've been dying to ask you for a couple days now about the Russian opposition leader, Alexei Navalny. It appears he was poisoned last week. He's now in Germany, supposedly in stable condition. But to take us through the story and the significance of it.
Well, I mean, if you care about the fact that Russia, let's just talk big Russia for a minute, David, right? Because so much of what's going on in the world, Russia has been the counterweight to the U.S., whether it be the possible bounties that were taken out against American troops in Afghanistan, whether you take a look at what's going on in Syria and how President Putin pushed Russian troops in there with Russian aircraft and supported a horrible regime. And, you know, just almost in Libya now, they've put fighter jets in there. And you know, so if you're not interested in world affairs, but you are at least interested in America's interest around the world, you know, you really begin to see the menace that President Putin has played. And so the only challenge to him really is not what comes from outside, but what comes from inside the country. And, you know, I've covered lots of different opposition figures who have tried to move against Putin within Russia, none of them successful. But Alexei Navalny, he is a guy who has really presented a clear challenge to President Putin. He has motivated the street, and he has got people out demonstrating, and he has threatened to do in Russia what the opposition movement is doing in Belarus right now against President Lukashenko there, who just, you know, pulled off this ridiculously fraudulent election. So we know that Navalny was out campaigning in Siberia. He was out campaigning against the United Russia Party, which is President Putin's party. He boarded a flight to go back to Moscow. He had some tea at this airport in Tomsk in Siberia, and then he became very ill on board the airplane. The airplane had to do a forced landing in Omsk, which is another city. And there started this tug of war over the weekend, where this family trying to get Navalny out and get him to Germany. And finally, they were able to do it through the weekend. And he's being treated in Germany. And indeed, they say he was poisoned.
So he was poisoned. He's been targeted before. I seem to remember it was maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, where he had some ink that sort of exploded in his face. He was covered with green ink, and then he made a sort of big deal of it, saying, look, they're trying to target me. I wonder if you could put this sort of in context, though, in terms of the timing. Why would Putin or the supporters of Putin want to target Navalny now?
Well, I mean, I talked to Bill Browder today, and Bill Browder is an American-born British citizen who has campaigned relentlessly against President Putin, and he brought in the Magnitsky Act, and that is a series of sanctions against Putin's inner circle. The Magnitsky Act is named after his lawyer, who was jailed in Russia and killed in prison. I mean, he died in prison, and Bill Browder says that he was murdered in prison. And those series of sanctions brought about by the United States, brought about by England, which are now under consideration by the European Union, those sanctions are very important. And Browder really is one of the experts on Russia right now. And he said he believes not only was Navalny poisoned, and we know that from the clinic in Germany today, but he believes it was done by the Federal Security Service, who had been monitoring Navalny 24/7 and has admitted that they knew about his whereabouts, what he ate, where he went. So he says it was the FSB. And he says it was Putin. And when I said, look, how can you say that, Bill? You know, how do you know it's President Putin? Because Navalny has been critical of so many different people in Russia. His website has all sorts of corruption, in-depth reports about all kinds of people close to Putin, you know, their yachts, their villas in France, some really embarrassing stuff, including even against the former Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev. And he said, when it comes to Navalny, and he has a point, he is such a high-profile person that only Putin could give the order for that to take place, because there are a lot of different political ramifications about trying to kill Navalny and poisoning him.
We're talking with Dana Lewis. He's our chief European correspondent for Quick Hits News, which you can see every day. We publish our tape show. It's a 15-minute show, sort of a round table of journalists, and we talk about the top stories overseas and across the United States. And that comes out about 5 o'clock each day. But we also like to use the HAPS TV live app to be able to do live, longer conversations. And we're chatting with Dana, who was a bureau chief in Moscow, covered Moscow for 12 years for several different networks.
Dana, and is incredibly long-winded, as you can tell already.
Well, Dan, I got to ask you, I mean, people would say if Putin or if the Russians want to get rid of Navalny, why would they try to poison him? Why not, some other sort of assassination method?
I mean, it tends to be kind of the tradecraft of the security services in Russia because a lot of the times it's untraceable. But at the same time, I mean, there are only certain agencies that would have access to one of the largest chemical biological stockpiles in the world inside Russia. That's why when they attempted to poison a member of the GRU, a former member of the GRU in Salisbury, England, they used a chemical nerve agent against him. When they went after a former member of and he survived, barely. And then they went after a former member of the Federal Security Service who was living in London and was going against Putin, and they poisoned him with a biological agent, a nuclear agent, actually. So, on one hand, they have access. On the other hand, it is kind of a signature. I mean, often they want to send a message, and they send the message that if you turn against the security services in particular, you will do so at your peril.
There has been widespread condemnation, at least in Europe, for this apparent poisoning of Navalny, and not so much in the United States. Dana, what usually happens in Moscow when leaders around the world condemn Vladimir Putin? Do they just sort of ignore it? Is it a point of pride? What happens in that scenario?
Well, I mean, I think there are pressure points, right? And certainly the sanctions have been pressure points against Russia. There are a number of sanctions that target his inner circle. And more importantly than just targeting them, they go after their assets abroad and they freeze them. Because that's the one thing about this is no longer the Soviet Union where there was an iron curtain and they are protected behind the iron curtain. They all have their money abroad. There is, it's a kleptocracy where they have pocketed hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. President Putin himself, owns property abroad in France, for instance, through other people. So when foreign governments get after him, and it creates a lot of pressure on their pocketbooks, and that's ultimately what they care about. And that's why the Magnitsky Act and Bill Browder's efforts are so important. And the EU is likely to adopt its own version of the Magnitsky Act sanctions after the United States have done it, Canada's done it, and as I mentioned, Britain has done it.
Now, the Magnitsky Act, some people may say, well, that sounds familiar. And that goes back, of course, to the allegations of Russian connections to the Trump campaign in 2016 and some alleged promises by the Trump campaign that they would lift Magnitsky Act restrictions and essentially make it easier on Russia and sort of take some of the heat off of them. Dana, where does the Magnitsky Act stand right now?
Well, the Magnitsky Act was passed in the United States, and the sanctions remain in place. And it's going to be very hard to lift them, even if President Trump wants to do so. And I would note that it is absolutely incredible to many ex-diplomats, including like the former ambassador to Moscow, Mike McFaul, who has been speaking out a lot on social media. Why on earth isn't the White House and President Trump condemning what has happened to Navalny and demanding answers from the Kremlin? And again, we go back and to these possible connections and compromises of an American presidency by the Russians. And it raises spectacular questions that, one day I think will be answered. But certainly we have no doubt, you have no doubt that the Russians tried to hijack the 2016 election in favor of President Trump. And President Trump again and again refuses to speak out on any of these issues against President Putin. Why is that?
Alexei Navalny, he's in a hospital in Berlin. He's said to be now in stable condition, so it looks like he's going to survive. Do you think he goes back to Russia and perhaps even stronger with a higher international profile because he has survived this? Or does this essentially send him a message that, okay, you best stay out of Russia at this point?
I think, Navalny was arrested some 13 times. His brother was put in prison in Russia for 3 years, and I think remains there now as we speak. And I don't think that Navalny, if he doesn't have any long-term health effects, he won't hesitate to go back. And he will, you're right, he will go back stronger, and as kind of a martyr of the opposition political movement. And, here's how it shakes out in Russia, right? They control all of the media. When I was there, we saw the Kremlin take over all of the main television channels, and they program the nightly news, and they tell them what their lineup's going to be. They tell them what they're supposed to report on a particular issue. But social media penetration's been growing and growing, and that's where people like Alexei Navalny's been getting traction. And people have heard about it in Russia, and they'll continue to hear about it. And I think he will become a poster boy for the opposition movement, if he isn't already. In many ways, he is already in Russia against President Putin.
We're talking with Dana Lewis. He has spent more than a decade covering Russia from Moscow. He's our chief European correspondent on Quick Hits News. You can see Quick Hits News every day. We publish it about 5 o'clock. It's a recorded conversation, about 15 to 18 minutes. You get the top stories around the world and across the United States from our veteran correspondents. Dana, you were saying on today's show, which is going to come out later today, that it was quite the scene in Omsk when Navalny was at the hospital there. The Russian doctors are trying to treat him. The security services are there. His wife couldn't get in.
Yeah, I mean, it was high drama over the weekend because his wife showed up there and started demanding that he be airlifted out to Germany. They had a plane come in from Germany, and the doctors were trying to keep him there. And they were worried. I mean, his press officer was tweeting a lot over the weekend on Twitter that they were worried that they were trying to keep him there long enough to get whatever was in his system out of his system, or they were trying to re-inject him with something to make it, look like a diversion, and that maybe it wasn't this poison, maybe it was alcohol, maybe it was some kind of psychedelic drug of some kind. But in the end, they were able to get him out, even though it took a lot of yelling on her part, and she was pushed by, federal security services out of the way. They finally, after she wrote a direct letter to President Putin in the Kremlin saying, release my husband, and after the Kremlin was urged by France and Germany and others, including the Foreign Secretary of Britain, Dominic Raab, got involved, and he was finally allowed to fly out, and he's in the clinic in Germany. And again, they have come up and said that there's no question that he was poisoned. What he was poisoned with exactly, that's going to take some time to flush out chemically with chemical tests, but it was likely some kind of nerve agent.
Dana, I want to pick up on something you said a moment ago, and that is that the Lukashenko support seems to sort of be growing on social media, and that while the Russians control so much of the media and the broadcast stations and the newspapers, that the social media really seems to be something of they may consider something of an insurgent threat to Vladimir Putin.
Did you say Lukashenko?
Up a little bit more about that. Well,
Did you say
sure.
Lukashenko? Yeah, Lukashenko is in Belarus, and David and I are laughing because we just did Quick Hits today, and I suddenly couldn't remember the name of the president of Belarus because we were talking about so many different things in Russia. But there is, since we're talking about Belarus, thank you, David. There is this
Sure.
big connection between what's taking place in Belarus and what's taking place in Russia, because the one thing that the Kremlin deeply fears is that the street will ignite in Russia against President Putin. And they're watching what's taking place, these huge demonstrations after this fraudulent elections in Belarus. And they're believing that Alexei Navalny, who has been saying things on social media, like the same thing is bound to happen in Russia. And he's been out in Siberia where there are already